All praises, all praises, all praises to the heavenly, holy, almighty creator of infinity and all. Hello, family. This is Revelations.Unveiled. Detroit. We are back together again, converging and convening. And we are back so we can continue our analysis, our evaluation, our deliberation and discernment of the UN report for the case of reparations. And family, so far we have been through the introduction and the background and the historical overview, the legal framework, institutional policies, and we will be continuing as we are listening to the already constructed concepts of historical analysis as done by the world body, the United Nations. And this is in the continuous response of our visualizing and our seeing in real time how the political theater is playing out with the head actors as they are now being confronted with the growing and escalating wave of the ADOS, the American descendants of the enslaved movement, and their continuing and growing voice for reparations, the repair of the history of destruction and detriment and disenfranchisement to those brought here in bondage. It is time for the retribution and the reallocation of the resources that were robbed from the recipients of the unrighteousness of the construction of this land. And so, family, tonight we will be discussing or listening and hearing about the disparities in access, education, health, housing, and employment as part of this, what would we say, this direct illustration into our pineal area all the way to the pituitary. And so we shall continue with report A/33/61/addendum.2. The disparities in access to education, health, housing, and employment. The cumulative impact of racial motivated discrimination faced by African Americans in the enjoyment of their rights in education, health, housing, and employment, among other economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights, has had serious consequences for their overall well-being. Racial discrimination continues to be systemic and rooted in economic models that deny development to the poorest African American communities. More than 10 million of African Americans remain mired in poverty, and of that figure, almost half live in what is known as deep poverty. The working group is concerned that reports from across the country that there are police officers in schools without appropriate training, arresting children for minor offenses and dealing with behavior that previously would have been handled as part of the school disciplinary process, resulting in the criminalization of children's behavior and severe punishment. The police have had the authority to detain, frisk, and arrest children in school. For example, a black female student was violently arrested by a school reserve officer at Spring Valley High School in South Carolina in 2015. zero tolerance policies, and heavy-handed efforts to increase security in schools have led to the excessive penalization and harassment of African American children through racial profiling. African American children are far more likely to face harsh disciplinary measures than white children and are being pushed out of school and into the criminal justice system, a phenomena that has been described sadly as the school to prison pipeline. The working group is concerned by the underfunding and closure of schools, particularly in these poor neighborhoods with significant African American populations. The working group was particularly concerned to learn of the threats to close Chicago State University, a historically black university. In school curricula, the historical facts concerning the period of colonization, the transatlantic slave trade in Africa, and the enslavement of future Americans, which have been crucial to the organization of contemporary American society, are not sufficiently covered in all schools. The curriculum in some states fail to address adequately the root causes of racial inequality and injustice. This contributes to the structural invisibility of African Americans. The working group also received information about the de facto segregation of schools. The segregation appears to be nurtured by a culture rooted in the legacy of racial inequality and by failing to address the history of racial injustice, enslavement, and the Jim Crow laws. The working group noted that a number of factors contributed to the disparities faced by African Americans in realizing the rights to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health, which included lack of access to the health insurance coverage, lack of access to preventive services and care, and shortcomings related to the lack of diversity of cultural competency among those giving the care. While the implementation of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act had led to 20 million people getting health insurance coverage, states with some of the widest health disparities in the country have rejected expansion of Medicaid, one of the main tools to cover the uninsured. 9 out of the 10 people who fall into the coverage gap live in the South, and Black adults are more likely than any other racial group to be affected. The impact of social determinants such as lack of access to good quality and healthy housing conditions, lack of education and employment, and transportation barriers also continue to serve as impediments to full enjoyment of the rights to health. The working group learned that African Americans had limited access to food variety, including to healthy foods, as they were concentrated in poor neighborhoods with foods outlets selling unhealthy and even expired foods. African Americans have the highest rates of obesity, which is linked to food desserts. So the sweets and the candies and the cakes and the goodies lead to morbid obesity. The working group is concerned about the persistence of the de facto residential segregation in many metropolitan areas in the United States. In the working group's meeting with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, a series of maps were shown which not only starkly depicted high concentrations of African American families in low-income neighborhoods and districts, but also reflected the correlation between racial segregation and socioeconomic disparities in access to health, education, and even access to adequate food between African American population and white populations. The working group was informed that people of African descent were more likely than any people with similar borrowing characteristics to be victims of predatory lending, to receive higher cost loans, and to lose their homes to foreclosure. The Department of Housing and Urban Development recognizes that although the most blatant forms of housing discrimination have declined since the 1970s because of the implementation of the Fair Housing Acts, the forms of discrimination that persist raise the cost of housing searches for members of minorities and restrict their housing options. The working group also informed about racial steering, a practice employed by real estate agents to guide prospective property buyers either towards or away from neighborhoods on the basis of their race. In many of the places it visited, the working group heard from civil society and gentrifications that had a detrimental and disparate impact on African American areas. African American peoples are also concerned that they are disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards that impact on their health and standard of living. They are often forced to live in disadvantaged areas with hazardous environments in proximity to industrial toxicity, power stations, flood zones, and so on, and without access to social and commercial facilities. The most polluting industrial facilities across a range of sectors, from farming and mining to manufacturing, are more likely to be situated in poor and minority neighborhoods, including those of African descent. For instance, the working group is concerned about the possible health risks to African Americans on the account of the incinerator project in Curtis Bay, Baltimore, and the lead-contaminated water in Flint, Michigan. The working group was also informed about the destruction of public housing in some cities. At the same time, public funding for new housing appears to be insufficient to meet the demands of more and new housing. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, in 2015, of the more than 500,000 homeless people in the United States, African Americans constituted 40.4%. Wow, that is almost 200,000 people. Of them, 500,000. Wow. 200,000 of 500,000 homeless people are black. They also constituted 27.8% of the homeless people who were unsheltered. According to the Department of, despite the recovery of the United States economy, the impact of the 2008 and 2009 recession on African Americans is still very much present. The unemployment rate among African Americans is almost twice the national unemployment rate. The working group in particular was concerned about the level of unemployment among young African Americans without a high school degree. In 2014, the annual income for African Americans was just under half the income of white Americans who are not Hispanic. So if a white family makes 100,000, a black family makes 50,000 or less than that. Horrifying. People of African descent continue to be underrepresented in management positions. In 2013, they only accounted for only 7% of workers in management occupations. Instead, African Americans disproportionately work in temporary jobs with less security and lower salaries. Nearly 500,000 African Americans earn the minimum wage. The Equal employment opportunity commission continues to receive more than 30,000 complaints a year concerning racial discrimination. Multiple forms of discrimination. The working group studied intersectionality of the different forms of discrimination faced by people of African descent and heard experiences of racial discrimination based on ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, sex, and gender identity. The working group is particularly concerned by the increasing number of murders of transgender women of African descent and the increasing level of violence affecting them. Racial discrimination also disparately impedes the ability of African American women to maintain overall good health, control their sexuality and reproduction, survive pregnancy and childbirth, and parent their children. African American women in the United States die from pregnancy-related complications at a rate 3 to 4 times higher than that of white women. The working group is particularly concerned about the fact that 37% of the households headed by African American women live below the poverty line. The working group of experts on people of African descent shares the findings of the working group on the issue of discrimination against women in law and in practice in respect of African American women. In particular, the working group of experts on the people of African descent is concerned at the disproportionate number of African American women subjected to heightened levels of violence, including rape and sexual violence. It also deplores reports of police brutality and the increased number of killings. The increased number of killings of African Americans and women by the police. Furthermore, it is disturbing at the persistent, fatal consequences for women of the lack of gun control, particularly in the cases of domestic violence. All right, family. So that was a review of the disparities in health, employment, and living conditions for the African American so-called population of America. And so we're getting defined context where it is already founded with an international body, the historical and present condition and status, socioeconomically, legally, in the criminal justice system, the educational system, as it pertains to food, health, housing. All of these factors impede and impress upon the standard of having a basic, healthy, natural existence. And it has been our status for half a millennium since the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. And family, as the continuous growth of the American descendants of the enslaved's call for reparation continues, it is now becoming offensive at some of the responses of the political bodies in response to the righteous call. And so, family, we shall continue with these concepts and aspects of review, deliberation, and contemplation with the UN study and the HR report on the case for reparations. And so we shall continue to let our voice grow and show and glow in righteousness as we continue our principles stand for repair, retribution, reallocation. And until we are together again, I love you. I love you. I love you. This is Revelations.Unveiled. Detroit.